When contemplating the history of the Jewish people, most of us focus upon the Central and Eastern European story. In reality, though, for centuries, Eastern Europe did not serve as the center of world Jewry. Rather, the epicenter for world Jewry was found in Southern Europe on the Iberian Peninsula.
The Jewish world, the heart of the Jewish world, the intellectual, cultural, artistic world, was in Spain.
It is estimated that perhaps the Sephardic population at any given point in time in the Iberian Peninsula was in excess of 200,000, and it may have been even more than that. It's anywhere between 15 to 20% of the population of the Iberian Peninsula was Sephardic.
Nevertheless, when most of us hear the year 1492, the historical event that immediately comes to mind, the Spanish monarch's decision to send Christopher Columbus on his voyage to the New World. But for world Jewry, 1492 actually marks the beginning of a sad chapter in Jewish history. As Christopher Columbus set sail for the New World, the King and Queen of Spain issued their Edict of Expulsion. The Spanish Inquisition had begun.
For Jews, they were presented with impossible choices. You either had to abandon the faith of your fathers and convert to Christianity, or you had to practice Judaism in secret, become a crypto-Jew or a Marrano, or you had to leave the country that you were living in and seek exile elsewhere. Now, if you were a crypto-Jew and on the surface in your everyday life you appeared to be following Christian theology, but in your home privately you retained the religion of your fathers and you practiced Judaism, and you were discovered, you would then face torture and almost certain death, and sometimes that death could be very horrific, where in what was called an auto da fe, people were actually tied to a stake. Sometimes whole families were tied to a stake and burnt to death.
Rather than face that fate, many Jews fled the land they loved and left the Iberian Peninsula.
Those members of the Sephardic community that were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula either made homes in North African towns and cities, or in the Levant, as far across as Turkey, or they made their way to northwestern Europe, where a large number settled in what we know of as Holland today, which originally was called the Low Countries, and would have settled in cities like Amsterdam.
But while many Sephardic Jews moved to other parts of the Old World, some escaped to the New World with none other than Christopher Columbus, who some believe may have been Jewish or had Jewish roots. One such individual, Luis de Torres, born Yosef ben Halevi Havri, or Joseph, the son of Levi the Hebrew, Torres converted to Catholicism on the ship's docks, simply to gain permission for his passage to the New World. Christopher Columbus hired Torres to serve as his interpreter on his maiden voyage. Why? Historians have theorized that because Columbus thought he might find descendants of the lost tribes of Israel in the New World, he needed the Hebrew-speaking Torres on the voyage. As a result, when Columbus's vessels landed on Cuba in late 1492, de Torres disembarked, becoming what historians have labeled the first Jew to step foot in the Americas. So with the New World now discovered, many Sephardic Jews
looked for islands in the Caribbean to settle.
But Spain controlled much of the Caribbean.
Spain claimed all of the Caribbean, but they only occupied the islands known as the Greater Antilles. They occupied Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. The smaller islands of the Lesser Antilles were too insignificant for Spain to have an interest in.
So Barbados, for example, was part of the Lesser Antilles and therefore controlled by the United Kingdom, which allowed Jews to live openly. Cuba, on the other hand, remained under Spanish dominion and therefore was subject to the mandates of the Inquisition. In other words, Jews were not welcome on Cuba. So for all intents and purposes, not until 1898, when Spanish colonial rule ended with the United States victory in the Spanish-American War, were Jews truly able to establish a presence on Cuba. And during the early decades of the 20th century, both Sephardic Jews from the Near East and Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe immigrated to Cuba. In fact, Fidel Castro, the man who has been the face of Cuba and its communist revolution for decades, has suggested that he descends from Sephardic Jews. If true, many point to his maternal grandfather as the likely Jewish relative, a man who moved to Cuba from Turkey during the wave of Sephardic immigration to the island in the early 1900s. Similarly, the family of Dr. Myra Levy, the president of the Sephardic Hebrew Center in Havana, moved to Cuba from Turkey in the early part of the 20th century.
There was a revolution in Turkey, and he decided that the young Jewish men have to go to the army. And they don't want to go to the army, so they decide to emigrate. Where? To Latin America. Why? Because we speak Spanish and they spoke Ladino. So the assimilation was very easy. And then arrived to Cuba. We are talking 1970s, 1920s, and the Americans were investing in Cuba in the sugarcane industry, and they were investing in the main railroads. They were work for everybody. So they write back and said, come to Cuba. Money's growing in the trees. So in between 1970s and the 30s, a lot of Sephardic people arrived to Cuba.
As for Ashkenazi Jews,
with the rise of fascism in Europe, it became quite clear to some Jewish families looking down the line that the medieval pogroms would be nothing compared to what fascism would unleash on the Jewish communities of Europe. So then you had a new wave of Jewish migration to the Caribbean.
Consider Jacob Berezniak Hernandez, rabbi of the Orthodox Temple in Havana, Adat, Israel.
My family that came from Poland, they were immigrants, and they came to Cuba. But it was in 1925.
Or Adela Dworin, president of the Beth Shalom Synagogue, the Ashkenazi Temple in Havana, Cuba.
My parents came from Eastern Europe. They came just in time before the Second World War. I was born in Cuba. I'm very thankful to this country because my father and my mother, they lost all their relatives in Pinsk. It was Poland, then it was Soviet Union, now it's Belarus.
And we cannot forget the passengers on the SS St. Louis. This ship sailed from Europe to the Americas in May 1939, with over 900 European Jews seeking refuge from the horrors unraveling on the continent. While the United States refused to accept any of the passengers, in the end, Cuba did take in about 25 of these Jewish souls. The remaining were forced to return to Europe. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So through the conclusion of the Second World War and up through the end of the 1950s, a growing and vibrant Cuban Jewish community was thriving with about 15,000 members.
We lived in a ghetto, but not a ghetto like in Warsaw. It was a fantastic ghetto. We were enamored with Cuba. They treated us well. There was no discrimination, but simultaneously, because of the life in the ghetto, you became very, very Jewish. I have gone to a Jewish school to learn Yiddish and Spanish in the early 40s. And then I started belonging to a number of clubs, Zionist clubs in Cuba. In 1946, in Havana, it was inaugurated the first monument of the Holocaust in Latin America. It was a very small monument in a cemetery in Havana, in a Jewish cemetery.
But as much as Rafael Kravik loved Cuba and even supported the principles of the Cuban Revolution in its earliest days,
in 1960 I had to leave because they put me in jail for a few days and so forth in the Castro regime, and I decided it was time to go. I came to Miami.
and Rafael Kravik was not alone in escaping from Cuba.
Between 1959 and 1961, 90% of the community left, most of them to the States.
And in the years after the Cuban Revolution, life was challenging for the Jews who remained on the island, which numbered around 1,500.
Well, it was a period of time that it was difficult for religions.
We lost 2 generations after the revolution, but in the 60s, 70s, 80s.
Nevertheless, over the years, the Cuban Jewish community has survived, even thrived, with critical help from World Jewry.
We are surviving, thank you, of the Jewish from the States, most from the States, more than any part of the world, even from Israel.
Panamanian Jewish community that they decide that send me to Israel. I was very generous. It was the time that I go to Israel to study in a yeshiva. I never came before. I have classes all the time. I was discovering many things, and it was a remarkable experience for me.
Thanks the Joint and other American organizations, other Canadian organizations, so we are here. They are supporting the Jewish community. It's a small community, but a very vibrant community. We celebrate all the holidays. We had Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we had Simchat Torah, and we are very, very active in the community. We have a Sunday school with about 90 kids between the ages of 3 and 18. They come every Sunday morning, and we are teaching them a little Hebrew history, tradition.
And recently, the community received enormous, albeit unexpected support from a philanthropic individual visiting the island.
We had a visit of an American Jew, and he was a tall man with gray hair. And he asked me, what is the most important goal you have in the community? So I told him to send 50 members of the community to the Maccabi games. So he asked me, why don't you send them? So I told him we don't have the money. So he said, how much money do you need? I looked to his old t-shirt, and I was sure that he cannot give more than $5 or $10. So we needed almost 50,000. So he said, but tell me how much money. I told him. He sent part of the money. Part was sent by other donors from the United States. And then I asked him, why don't you buy a new t-shirt if you have so much money? So he said, what it says in my t-shirt? It said Giants. I don't know what is Giants. So he told me, I'm the owner of the New York Giants. His name is Steve Tisch. Maybe you have heard about him. And he's a wonderful person. We sent our people to Israel, to Jerusalem. We won 6 medals in the Maccabi games. So I'm a happy person, you see. I'm so happy.
This is the first time for all. Also was the first gold medal for Cuba. So now we are making history. We feel very proud about all the whole delegation is very happy for our results. We don't expect that because the Israeli team is very, very good. So it was like a miracle.
And those athletes are more than just stars in their sports. They are bright lights in Cuba's Jewish community. They are revitalizing Judaism in Cuba.
It's wonderful, you see, when we see the kids they know how to make the prayers, the blessings, and they know more Judaism than their parents. But now we have a new generation who knows a lot about Judaism.
Meet one of those individuals. And then there is Orly Solomon, also known as Candela, born in Israel, raised in France, now living in Cuba. Candela is blending her love for Israeli music with Cuban salsa. Listen to her spicy rendition of Hava Nagila. Hava Nagila in the streets of Havana? How is that possible? That on the other side. Welcome back. Hava Nagila in the streets of Havana? How is that possible?
I never suffered any kind of anti-Semitism or persecution. I never felt like a second-class citizen.
In fact, over the years, the Castro brothers, who remember may have Sephardic roots, have visited the Cuban Jewish community.
In 1998, for a Hanukkah party, you know what's Hanukkah? So we had a visit of then the president of the country was Fidel Castro. So he came for Hanukkah party, and he was very touched when he saw about 300 Jews celebrating Hanukkah. 2-3 years ago, we had his brother, now the president, Raul Castro. He also came for Hanukkah party. He put the yarmulke, he lit the first candle, and we are We are well treated by the government.
And the Cuban government has specifically allowed the island's Jewish community to engage in Jewish dietary practices, including kosher slaughter.
The generosity of the Cuban government, we have a special permission to go to the slaughterhouse. We deliver these beasts almost for free. It's a subvention by the Cuban government. And it's a big mitzvah that we have to the all Jews in Havana, because this is the kosher beef is for everybody in the Jewish community of Havana.
Now, the Jewish Cuban community was put in an uncomfortable spotlight when American Alan Gross was convicted and imprisoned for committing crimes against the Cuban state, specifically for importing satellite phones and computer equipment for the Jewish community without permission. During Gross's years in captivity, Jewish community leadership was permitted to visit him.
It was before Purim, you know what is Purim? Yeah. So I took him homontashin, you know what is homontashin? It's a typical food for pastry. And when they gave me half an hour to visit him, and when I finished the visit, so one of the officers told me, I gave you half an hour to visit Alan Gross. I gave you more time than Jimmy Carter.
And when Gross was released from Cuba and returned to the United States in December 2014, both American President Barack Obama and the Cuban Jewish community deemed the diplomatic move a Hanukkah miracle. Of course, Alan Gross's release was part of a much greater easing of tensions between the two countries, which ultimately resulted in the historic restoration of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba. Cuba's Jewish community has no doubt welcomed this thaw.
Things in Cuba are changing. Little by little, but they're changing. So perhaps in 5 years, I will say you, no, I don't have anything to worry about.
There are still 3 synagogues in Havana. You know the story, 1 Jew, 2 synagogues.
All joking aside, the 3 major synagogues on the island, Adat Israel, the Sephardic Hebrew Center, and Temple Beth Shalom, all in Havana, are ready to grow and would welcome even more visitors from North America and around the world. The Adat Israel Orthodox Synagogue, while the smallest in size, shines from its spiritual strength.
Right now, we are very happy in this congregation because we have about 125 families. We get a minyan almost every day. For sure, on Monday and Sunday, the reading of the Torah, and a minyan in the afternoon on the Friday night, and Saturday in the morning, Saturday in the afternoon also.
At the Sephardic Hebrew Center,
I have here 320 members. That means more or less 80 families. The happiest thing is that we are still here, and we are surviving.
Historic Sephardic Hebrew Center, surviving and thriving, it attracts visitors of all stripes with its Superior Museum, the first in Cuba to present an exhibition cost. And the largest congregation in Cuba, Temple Beth Shalom, or El Patronata, is helping Jewish life make its comeback, with services now held on a regular basis in its beautifully restored sanctuary. The temple serves Jewish community's de facto community center with its social hall, its extensive library, and even a pharmacy for the community.
This is a wonderful country with a wonderful weather, and especially if you are Jewish, you will really enjoy visiting the Jewish community and to see how we maintain Judaism alive. It's hard, but it's wonderful.
Think about it. Cuba's Jewish community is alive and well through over 5 decades of struggle and isolation.
It's a miracle that the Jewish community in Cuba exists.
But then again,
I always say that the Jew that don't believe in miracles is not a realistic person.
We could not have said it better ourselves, Rabbi. So, with relations between the United States and Cuba now normalized to the Caribbean, consider Cuba and visit a community who will welcome you with arms wide open.